America wasn't just some random country that was mediocre by accident. America was subjected to very intense levels of psychological warfare, attacks through the food, attacks through the culture that resulted in the degradation of the society and into the halfway collapse that we're already seeing. The question is, how do we get here and how do we get out of this? I think in order to understand how we got there, it's good to read people that talked about this and what was coming back in the 1990s. In fact, there was a book written in 1992 that talked about the entirety of this plan being rolled out by our day, and particularly bringing in foreign entities, weapons of mass migration, so to speak, and what effect that would have on the native population, combined with the toxic culture, combined with all the other elements that were part of the Tavistock, New World Order, you could say Club of Rome plan. In fact, one member of the Club of Rome went and talked to people in the White House back in the 1970s, and they were talking about different projects and entities that they could use to bring about these plans. You've heard me talk before about the discussions with Kissinger during that time period when Kissinger really adopted the eugenics Malthusian worldview, not just for the third world, like most people think, but actually for the entire Western world. And so part of this plan, it's known as the 2025 report or the 2020 report. You can find different versions of it, but in the very prophetic book written by former British intelligence operative, Dr. John Coleman, he lists a series of things that they would plan. This is back in the 70s, that they would try to roll out within the next several decades. And I'm going to read some of the elements of this, and we're going to see what we think in terms of how much of this has come to pass. And you're going to notice that the open borders agenda is also a huge part of this plan, and it was discussed decades ago as a way to weaken the existing population, to drive down wages, but more than all that, to really socially engineer and create a new culture in the West. The first element that was listed in this discussion from the New World Order was the creation, first and foremost, of a one world order. This one world order needed, first of all, a unified religion, a kind of New World Order church, so to speak, as well as a one world government that would be set up sometime around perhaps the 1920s and 30s, at least modeled on what was set up in the 20s and 30s with the League of Nations and then the later United Nations. That would have to be probably replaced down the road, or it would have to be given some kind of new authority and power rather than just being some sort of cultural debate forum. This religion would need to be based on a mix of the other religions, probably something like a blended Christianity or Islam or something New Age, Chrislam or something New Age. And we already see, by the way, of course, the Vatican pushing the idea of the monotheistic faith center, where all of the religions are really combined in the Abu Dhabi Faith Center. Number two would be the removal and the destruction of all nation state identity and national pride. That would have to be demonized and classed under racism. Of course, we've seen that immensely pushed out in the last 20 years. And people forget that the academic system, the university system, is one of the main tools for how this social engineering and how this mind control actually occurs. In fact, universities are kind of like California and New York. They pioneer and roll this stuff out decades ahead of the rest of the country, excepting at Middle America, a flyover country. So they push the brainwashing, and then the graduates then go into corporations, HR, they become sort of the spokesman. And then that is what results in the corporations eventually, after several years, becoming woke, because the people who go into the corporations have been through the corporate brainwashing system of the university. Now you might think, well, the university is a state thing, or it's perhaps private. All of these entities are really joined at the top. That's the point. It doesn't really matter whether we're talking about public or private at this level, because this plan was essentially a private corporate plan that really took over government a long time ago, or you could say it took over the government in various stages to entrench itself and to really push the same agenda, the same plan. And it became eventually global. And I think everybody saw that in the COVID era, because the entire world in terms of the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, was enforcing the same policies, pushing the same hashtags, pushing all the same, put this black image in your profile picture, or you don't, or you're racist, wear a mask, social distance, get your stabbies. Basically, every corporation in the world, megacorp, was on board with that. And that shows that there's already sort of an entrenched governing body of corporate elites and government elites. They all collude together. It's a revolving door at a very high level that are planning a corporate technocratic socialism. Where do we get corporate technocratic socialism? Well, we have to go back to what John Coleman wrote this book about, the Committee of 300, which is the British East India Company. And this became really the ultimate corporation of its time. It was making more money in a day or a week than, even if we adjust for the time difference, even corporations today. So probably bigger than Apple or something like that. And so they were really above the government. Even they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, and they didn't just specialize in furs and goods like that. They also specialized in slave trade and narcotics, opium, all kinds of goods, so to speak. So this was really a corporate slavery that existed under the British East India Company. And they were really tied at the hip to the British government. So there wasn't really a difference between these two entities. And one could even argue that corporate governance existed prior to that, even with perhaps the Vatican. Maybe the Vatican is the world's oldest sort of corporation government nation state that's its own city state. It's not subjected to any laws anywhere else. And its bank, of course, is the most secretive bank in the world, which provided, of course, a bunch of liquidity and secrecy for black operations during the Cold War, particularly drug running, drug trafficking, arms running, and Operation Gladio, which we've covered many, many times. So the corporate model functions as a perfect sort of inner, almost roundtable model. If you look at the roundtable society group out of the UK and Cecil Rhodes and those characters, really their secret model of an inner core elite of 12 people that they originally planned, it's kind of like a corporate governing board. So they're just calling it the round table and the wise men. But it's the same type of structure of a kind of a corporatocracy, or it's like Plato's Council of the Night, which exists in his later works, where the Republic Magnesia is no longer run by one philosopher king. It's actually run by a board of oligarchs, or basically intelligence operatives. Because if you listen to Plato, he describes that the governance board of Magnesia meets at night, hence the Council of Night, because they operate in secrecy. They send out spies. They govern the country without the knowledge of the people, because, of course, the people are too stupid and they need to be governed by this kind of esoteric elite. And interestingly, John Coleman, in his book, I'm not saying I agree with everything in his book. I think he got some things wrong, but in writing this in 1992 was pretty profound, because he was way ahead of his time, especially with the calls for technocracy and open border that he predicted that would be really essential to this plan, and they would roll that out in the next several decades. He goes on to talk about after the destruction of the idea of American patriotism and pride, the destruction of all religions as they are known, and particularly the Christian religion. Isn't it interesting that they have to really destroy Christianity, because that's the linchpin upon which Western civilization is built, and ideologically speaking. And that really means all the branches of Christianity, Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and even Protestantism. They all have to really be diluted, infiltrated, destroyed from within, or co-opted to become just sort of cutouts for Americanism in the Cold War, and then eventually for the New World Order after the Cold War. So now that we're post-Cold War, the alliances that the CIA made with so many churches and religious institutions during the Cold War, unfortunately, has led to them now being kind of tools for that same agenda. And that's precisely why Francis, for example, supports all the Davos agenda. Now, he goes on to talk about the control of every single person through some form of electronic or some form of mind control. And this is his definition of technocracy, and he's gotten it from Brzezinski's book from 1973, Between Two Ages. We've covered that many, many, many times. I'm not going to rehearse all that. But basically, the idea would be to robotize man, to make man more and more robotic, be that through a feedback loop of the information that he gets through the internet, making him more and more of a kind of a spurg, or through actual modification of humans through implantable chips, nanotech, signals manipulation, all the above. Really, if you read Brzezinski's book, he posits all of these as possibilities for the technocratic system when it rolls out. And we know that that was the plan that was chosen because it was really that book that caught the attention of David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. So they were really impressed with Brzezinski's book. I've got it up here on my shelf. And when he wrote that, he was recruited into working for the establishment. There's really only one establishment. It's the people like this right here. This Rockefeller's right there. That's who runs it. That's who set up the OSS and the CIA. That's who's aligned with the British Royal Society elites, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House, et cetera. It's all the same establishment. All these different things are all part of the same octopus. They're all just tentacles on the same octopus. So don't get confused in all the entities, but just keep in mind that ultimately they're all the same people in all these entities, and these different frontispieces and foundations and think tanks and all that are really pushing the same thing, and that's essentially Skynet here. Now, I'm not saying all tech is bad or that all even implantable stuff is bad. I have family members that have Parkinson's that have benefited from these kinds of things. So it's not that the tech itself is bad, it's that the system wants to utilize these things for total tracking, tracing, and control. And I think everybody finally realized that the so-called conspiracy people were correct when we saw during COVID the push for vaccine passports, tracking, tracing, all of that, especially the Gates Foundation and everything with ID that Gates was pushing. That's definitely what they wanted. And even to this day, you have people like Tony Blair still pushing a digital tracking and tracing control grid to make sure that you don't use too much carbon. Yeah, that's essentially where it's going, right? It's not just about your health, so to speak, in terms of whether you contracted some fake made up scam virus out of Wuhan or whatever, but whether or not you were actually as a human being a threat to society because of too much carbon output. And so really carbon tracking, tracing, all that, that's about controlling population. And controlling population doesn't just mean getting the population numbers down. That also means controlling you, tracking and tracing you on a day-to-day basis in everything that you do. And that's why he goes on to say the next part of this plan would be to end all industry and industrialization in the West, and particularly cheap energy and cheap power, to eventually reach what the Club of Rome had deemed was the zero growth society, sometimes called ZPG, zero population growth. But it's not just about population, it's also zero economic growth. So what they want in the West, what they wanted for many, many years, was to de-industrialize the West, and through different government deals, send a lot of the industry purposefully overseas for China and other countries to be built up. And then they say, well, nobody in America wants to work, which is not true. This was actually a top-down agenda that was determined. And I mean, this plan would have been way worse, and they would have gotten way further, by the way, if they had created the North American Union. If you remember that back in the day, Alex used to protest that. They wanted to create a corridor where they would have a giant road that would go from Canada all the way down to Mexico. And the purpose of this was really ultimately to damage the American workers and to utilize cheap foreign labor. And that's really a big part of everything that's a problem in the country, because it's not even so much about the cheap labor, but ultimately it's an issue of libertarian philosophy, which Silicon Valley purports to often believe. And in fact, I think in the early stages, a lot of people do believe in it. And then what happens is, and I'm not picking out anybody in particular, I think this happens across the board. Sometimes government comes in and buys out. Sometimes there's contracts between private entities and government, which allows certain companies to get an edge, tax breaks, whatever. We saw this especially with some of the big Silicon Valley companies that got seed funding from DARPA and the CIA, Facebook, and others. And so what happens then is you get this sort of monopoly and oligopoly with these entities that can then have an immense amount of power to then try to say that they're going to fix society or whatever. But what happens is that there's a clash of duties or obligations, because on the one hand, the corporation has obligations to the shareholders, and they have obligations to save money, perhaps billions of dollars with labor. But at the same time, the population, the workers, the existing demographic group, they might have other allegiances that are not ultimately to shareholders or to a bottom line. So now we have a conflict between two allegiances within society. And this, for example, is why kings, in part, I mean, kings were oftentimes corrupt. I'm not trying to just say kings were good, but one reason there were tariffs was because it was a protection for workers within that country. That meant that you couldn't just bring in foreign workers that would do the same work for pennies on the dollar and then send that money back home. There was a protection there through the tariff. And I don't know to what degree that does or doesn't exist in America anymore. I mean, Trump has made positive statements about bringing back tariffs. I think that's a good idea. That would definitely help the country. But there is a coordinated plan, is what I'm trying to say, that ultimately is all about deindustrializing the entire West, and especially the United States, because for the technocratic corporate socialist government to come about, America is really a big problem, and especially middle America. That's why the coastal cities hate middle America so much, is because they're part and parcel in this philosophy of creating a global socialist technocratic order. And unfortunately, as H.G. Wells said, sometimes libertarians can actually help participate in that, because it's libertarian companies, supposedly Silicon Valley had this sort of libertarian ethos for so long, that really builds the infrastructure that then can be turned over to a socialist control, even though they have built a company for so long on the basis of liberty and freedom. But then it becomes Facebook, classic example, right? Silicon Valley is free market, supposedly. All the developers, investors, and all this pile in, and then you as humans contribute all the energy and all the information to essentially make Facebook as a test case into a giant entity that is basically spying on everyone's data collection, all that, which has all now been admitted. But it should have been evident from the beginning, because, of course, it was funded by CIA money, In-Q-Tel money from the very get-go. But you can see that that was an example where, even under the auspices of free market and all the people coming to it to be freely expressing their ideas, over time, it clamped down and shut down everybody's speech, and was stealing everyone's data, and was colluding with government. And then Zuckerberg apologizes, oh, my bad, sorry, I like Trump now, right? So that's a great example of what I'm talking about, where the libertarian phase was used to sort of dupe everyone, get them there, and then it flips over into a technocratic control. So we always have to be leery of this and this possibility. And so many tech companies have done this exact same plan and model, to where it appears libertarian and free, and then it switches. So industrialization is something that won't actually work, though, if you export this to places where the labor is subpar, or importation of entities and people that are subpar. This will actually destroy the existing company. So it doesn't seem very feasible to me, other than through enforced DEI measures, which I totally disagree with. It doesn't make sense to actually do this. Why would you enforce these policies which actually hurt the companies? And I don't just mean woke, I mean like hiring policies like diversity, equity, inclusion, which would actually not be based on the merit of the individuals coming in, but would actually be based on these sort of affirmative action quotas. These are actually going to damage companies, and they're going to damage production. They're going to damage goods. They're going to decrease the quality of everything in the West. And here's what I'm saying. That's by design. It's not just about socialism and getting people's money or taxes or whatever. There's a long-term plan that Coleman is talking about, which is partly to deindustrialize the West, break down America as a nation state, destroy its existing religious and cultural heritage, whatever's left of it. It's already largely been destroyed. I mean, what does it even mean to be an American anymore, other than what we make money, what apple pie, porn? I don't know what it means to be an American. The founding documents don't matter to people who come from these foreign countries, especially Islamic countries who have no concern for the Enlightenment values of the United States. It really just makes no sense unless that you understand. No, it makes perfect sense if there's a long-term plan to destroy the West and to flip it over into a kind of socialist technocracy. And they can utilize, as H.G. Wells said, a kind of libertarianism to get there. In fact, H.G. Wells, in one of his books, I can remember it's Open Conspiracy or New World Order, he says to his fellow Marxists, you Marxists are too short-sighted. You think that the problem and your enemy is the free market capitalists. They're not your enemy. They're the ones that are going to build the infrastructure that we will take over. And when we take it over, we will create a technocratic control grid that won't be based on these Enlightenment libertarian ideas. So Coleman goes on to say that after they get this in place, when they have sufficiently deindustrialized the West, then there will be a technocratic control grid that's created, that's rolled out, a kind of a Skynet to control you when there's no jobs, there's no money. Oh, but look, we've got a UBI, a basic income that's going to come. It's going to be your credits that roll out. That is essentially what's already been announced and proposed. They haven't actually done it, but you notice, I mean, Zuckerberg was talking about a UBI a few years ago. So the very things that John Coleman wrote in 1992, this was way before Silicon Valley was even close to what it is today. I mean, it was big, but it wasn't like it is now. And he was telling you back then that they're going to try to roll out a technocratic universal basic income, which is a form of socialism. And on top of that, the other ways that they would do this to deindustrialize would be to export all of the industry to countries where there's an available pool of slave labor. On top of that, he says, and he mentions the Global 2000 report of Kissinger. He talks about the legalization of all forms of vice and degeneracy to further demoralize the West. This demoralization is not accidental, it's by design, and it was part of the cultural warfare that entities like Tavistock had been studying since World War I, and even prior to that, with the lead up to World War I through Wellington House. So they mastered the techniques of propaganda, including culture war, and that's why they enlisted people like the Frankfurt School who had engaged in culture war as well. We were talking about these reports, these different discussions amongst the Kissinger era of the government. Kissinger working really as the sort of the liaison of the Rockefellers to set up the plans for depopulation. And I wanted to mention, as I've been pointing out quite a bit the last week, the rollout of the UFO nonsense is really ramped up intensely in the last few weeks. And I think that that plays into this perfectly, because although I don't think Dr. Coleman mentions UFOs, what he does mention quite a bit in the book is the creation of a new mythos, of a new ideology for the West to believe in. But that mythos and that ideology has to really be amenable to and really sort of push people into the idea of a technocratic control by a global government. And so if the religion doesn't do that, it's really useless. But if you look at the whole history of the alien mythos of Roswell, Area 51, the Betty and Barney Hill case, George Adamski, Alan Dulles as the head of the CIA, really protecting Adamski and furthering that narrative. If you watch documentaries like Mirage Men, you'll see people like Richard Doty are interviewed, who as a counterintelligence operative discusses at length how he was able to pick out people to be disseminators of disinformation on the whole alien mythos. And he points out that they were literally filming fake videos and telling these people who would then, in various decades, Paul Benowitz, Mr. Bob Moore, I think is the next guy, to really push out all this nonsense about reverse engineered alien technology, and that the government was, keeping this as a secret. Well, now the government has come out in the last couple of years and said, okay, yes, we found hidden alien tech, and now Tom DeLonge from Blink-182 is going to tell you the truth, and we've got generals who've talked to him. Trust us, it's all cool, which is all obviously a bunch of psychological operation nonsense. It's obviously fraudulent. There's not any explicitly clear evidence of extra extraterrestrial biological entities. There might be unexplained phenomena, but that doesn't tell us that it's aliens or that we were seeded here via panspermia, which is a favorite myth of the global elite, going back to even Isaac Newton believed in panspermia, all the way up to Watson and Crick. Many others have talked about the possibility, oh, we were actually put here by aliens to be farmed. And again, all of that is just really nonsensical when you dig into it. You don't have to dig very far at all. And even the famous cases are all debunked as hoax stories borrowed from science fiction of abductions. So why is this? Why is this such a powerful narrative? Well, as we pointed out last week in the 1960s Brookings Report, they said that Institute report, they said that they would be able to destroy Western civilization's mythos if they were to announce alien life. And so when Reagan says the United Nations back in the 80s that he's often concerned about how an external space threat would unite all the nations together and that they could put aside their differences of the Cold War, he might have been actually telling us where they wanted to go with this idea of a fake narrative of, it doesn't have to be an invasion, it can just be, you know, the announcement of alien life, as the Brookings Institute report says, to shake everyone's belief in the incarnation of Christ or whatever, to introduce a new kind of religion. Maybe that's the true religion that, you know, the Pope, because the Pope has even talked about alien life. So maybe he'll come out and support this announcement and, oh, yes, we need to support our space brothers. And that's what all the religions were really pointing to when they were talking about the, you know, belief in God or the angels or whatever. They're really just aliens. This fits perfectly with the new religious ethos that Coleman talks about they want to introduce. And again, this is all stuff, I mean, the religious, I don't know if the religious stuff is in there, but the Global 2000 report that we read about, people like Cyrus Vance, people like Henry Kissinger, they were talking about how to upend the West to make it more amenable to where they want to go. And you can look at places like Europe where NATO and other entities basically ran the same types of operations in Europe to put Europe into the European Union. And it was actually the OSS and CIA that literally created the European Union. That's on record in the Johann Ratu book. It was not Hitler that created it. Hitler had his own plan for it, but that's not what succeeded. What succeeded was the European project and the European steel and coal community project. Those all were the beginnings of the European Union. But it took a lot of psychological operations. It took re-education, literally re-education camps in Germany to re-educate the Germans. That's what the OSS and the CIA set up. So you always think, oh, the communists, the Soviets set up re-education camps. Well, the OSS did it too. The CIA set up re-education camps in Germany to get Germans to not be interested in engineering. Absolutely, because Germans are some of the best engineers on the planet. Why would they do that? Because they didn't want Germany rebuilding and rearming. They wanted Germany to be agrarian, and I guess now into, you know, weird sprockets, sex stuff. I don't know what Germans are supposed to be into, but that was all run by Uncle Sam, right? To essentially re-engineer and retool a German state into something whatever they have now, which is basically something Islamic. And you can look at Europe and how they did that with Europe over the last several decades as a test case, as an example of what they want to do to America as well. It's a little bit more difficult because America's vast, it's sort of spread out. It's a lot of different states. Really, America's a bunch of different countries. You know, the South bears little to no resemblance to you know, California or something like that. So they're vastly different. So it's a little more challenging to make all of America into some sort of European Union socialist hellhole. But they can do it through longer phases and stages of propaganda, drugs, flooding the country with drugs is a big part of this operation. Again, John Coleman said that they would flood the country not just with, you know, back in the 1980s and 90s, like cocaine or whatever, but really crazy stuff like the fentanyl, which we've seen. And this is because in the plans of the Club of Rome, they discussed the fact that there's at least 3 billion what they call useless eaters. And so the Global 2000 report under Carter via Kissinger had stated that there would have to be a massive reduction of the population of the United States. This is back in the 1970s, to around 100 million. That was their projected plan back in the days of Kissinger and Carter and Cyrus Vance, was to get the U.S. down to 100 million by the year 2050. So notice that they had planned out many, many decades in the Global 2000 documents and others around that time. There's also the 91, 92 Rio meetings that Bush and Maurice Strong were at. They were discussing the same types of things of transitioning the American economy over into de-industrialized service economy. This is all by design. That's the key thing is here, that people think that this is all just happening organically, and they don't think about long-term 50, 75-year plans. But the Global 2000 report that was accepted and approved by Carter officially as U.S. doctrine under the Secretary of State, the State Department, this became a plan to actually change America. It's not, everyone knows about, oh, well, Kissinger did a State Department Memorandum 200, which was about the depopulating the third world. Yeah, they also talked about America. And so this is why right around the same time, actually a couple of years prior to this, you had the adoption of all of America's Planned Parenthoods had adopted the Berelson Memo, which was the Rockefeller Population Report on pushing the gay lifestyle, pushing all alternative forms of living, open marriages, open whatever. That was all pushed in the Berelson Memo, admittedly, to help change America into a socialist country. It actually says that more they would have more taxes, there would be more socialism if they were able to get more and more people to not have families and to live in these sort of alternative lifestyles. At the same time, the Stanford Research Institute was putting out papers on alternative lifestyles, pushing alternative living. People like Alvin Toffler even talked about how they would attach alternative sexual lifestyles to other alternative movements like anarchism, vegetarianism, nowadays veganism, communal living, intentional communities. All of these kinds of experimental lifestyles were pushed and promoted after the 1960s countercultural revolution by design in the white papers. So it's not organic, it's not random, right? You've got boomers at the Esalen Institute saying that they want to have sex with angels and aliens, literally. In the 1970s, they wanted to figure out how in rituals to have sex with alien angels. I'm not joking, that's in the official history of the Esalen Institute. So like, sounds crazy to you, but this is all in the documents. When you actually read these documents, that's their actual plan. So that's why they push so hard the legalization of all forms of crazy drugs, which will eventually happen. I mean, I think there's a positive use for certain drugs. I'm not trying to say that, I'm not some like Puritan teetotaler here, but the point is that it's released on the public as a form of social engineering and weaponry. It's a weapon. And the packing people into massive megacities was a big part of this. In fact, the Club of Rome had studied this intently, according to Dr. Coleman, and that people were much more easy to control and manage if they were sort of packed into these megacities. And suppression of all scientific development except for that which is deemed beneficial by the committee. So this means that there's actual real advances that are made in medicine and technology, but they're actually suppressed because they don't want that out for the public. They want that only for certain select members of the elite. And they intentionally want to give us subpar or even damaging dysgenics-based products and technologies. Next, they would cause limited wars in certain regions and through certain advanced countries to create starvation and disease in third world countries that would help meet the third world goals of reducing the population by 3 billion. Now, this does fit into Kissinger's State Department Memorandum 200 and the Global 2000 report, because if you think about COVID, Alex often talks about how many vast numbers of people died in the third world as a result of the COVID measures, because supply chains were interrupted. And so you had really necessary, fertilizers and other things, grain that didn't reach the third world. And you even had people from the establishment during the COVID nonsense writing that, well, this is actually good because it helped the planet shut down and it helped the planet depopulate because humans are hurting the planet. So that's literally vindicated during the whole COVID nonsense. Next, he says that there would need to be all forms of demoralization released in the United States to weaken the moral fiber of the nation and to demoralize American workers and the working class by, number one, mass unemployment, but at the same time importing masses of foreign workers. This would be done at a top-down elite corporate level, and thus the jobs would dwindle in the West by design as the Club of Rome helped to push zero growth policies in the West, while none of those policies or those strictures are mandated for the East, for Asia, for China, for Eurasia, or whatever. So there's an intentional allowing and pushing and promoting of the building up of rival countries. So no, China at this level is not an enemy. They worked hand in hand with the global elite to be built up. But rather, this would have the effect of, through toxic culture, and eventually he doesn't even mention, he mentions a lot of deviant sexuality, but he doesn't mention, even John Coleman would have been surprised at the trans agenda, how widely promoted that is. The youth of the land would be encouraged by means of degenerate music and toxic culture and drugs to rebel. Thus, they would eventually not be able to pair bond and create families. This was all part of the Tavistock Institute's plans, who prepared their studies and their research for the global elites and the oligarchs to push this in America. Tavistock, for example, directed Stanford Research to undertake the works of Willis Harman. I've quoted and cited Willis Harman many, many times on my channel. You can notice right here, Coleman is arguing that this book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, which is not a conspiracy book, it's actually a book about how the entire Western world needs to be essentially inverted, that women need to be running everything, women need to be CEOs. We've listened too long to masculine patriarchal systems. It's time to invert and reverse all systems so that women run everything, literally. And we have more and more essentially socialism. He argues that book wasn't actually written by Marilyn Ferguson, but was in fact put out by Stanford Research and was largely written by Willis Harman, aka Changing Images of Man, and so forth. To keep people everywhere from deciding their own destinies, there would be many, many managed crises. So entities would be set up to stack layers and layers of governmental control, which are ultimately controlled not even by the government or the elected officials, but by the deep state. So you would have entities like FEMA being set up that would have regional control, and it's just more and more management of crises. And the crises may be real, or they might just be capitalized upon if they're fake or whatever. But the point is that you use the crises, never let a good crisis go to waste, as Rahm Emanuel says. You steer it into what your goal is. So if your goal is more taxation, use the crisis. Our entity, our government control system is underfunded. 9/11 wouldn't have happened if we'd had billions of dollars more funding. So you see the crises lead to more funding, more taxation, and more problems. And as I said with the alien stuff, the introduction of more and more cults and new religions. These cults and new religions are actually key means by which alternative lifestyles can be promoted. And it's not just weird, wacky stuff, Scientology or that kind of stuff. It's also Hindu. It's also New Age. It's also foreign religious traditions, Islam, mass imported as well to the West, and also the recent heresy of dispensationalism, which is all based on a recent invention that the nation state of Israel is actually the church, and that's actually where everybody's focus should be, and the rapture is coming, and the Antichrist is coming, all of which is a bunch of nonsense in terms of historic Christianity. None of that was true in any Christian group 200 years ago. But that was actually a recently created idea for geopolitical ends and as well as other things. He talks about liberation theology, Muslim brotherhood. So you would basically have this importation into the West of all kinds of crazy ideas. Everything from, on the one hand, radical Islam, Salafi groups. As you know, I've debated all these top Muslims over the last 5 or 6 years. They're all public debates. I think the only one I haven't debated is Mohammed Hijab, and he says I'm not popular enough for him to debate. Now, that's an excuse, but the other ones that I've debated, you'll notice they're all basically Salafi. So they're all basically the most extreme branch of Islam. So why are the most vocal ones the ones that are the most extreme. Well, I think this is by design. I think there are entities that are pushing this in the West. Even the Tates have adopted Islam, or at least Andrew has adopted Islam and pushed it heavily in the West because, I don't know why, maybe because he met with Saudis, who knows? But he's pushed that because it's part of an overall agenda to push foreign religious commitments onto the West, because they think that they've gained an upper hand in terms of the weakness of Christianity. And absolutely, Christianity is weak. I don't think most forms of Christianity are really even could even be called Christianity. They're so bad with, like trans bishops, and I mean Episcopal, Methodist, like all that stuff is just like gone. So the people who at least believe in trying to adhere to Christian teaching, they're also still weakened by a bunch of weird heresies like the rapture and all kinds of nonsense like that, dispensationalism. So that's put the West in an extremely terrible situation, with the system, the government, and the corporate elite actually pushing and promoting all forms of weird, fringe, foreign religious groups, cults, and movements. And then Dr. Coleman goes on to say that you'll expect more and more of this, because religious liberation and liberation theology is really a covert form of socialism, but it's not Marxists and KGB people in Moscow pushing it. It's actually pushed by Western elites, you see. In fact, the Rockefellers put out a report many, many years ago. You could still find this on academia.edu, where they said that you might think that they would be against liberation theology back in the 70s and 80s, but actually Nelson Rockefeller said he supported it because liberation theology allowed Christians to finally accept birth control, abortion, and population control. So there's absolutely nothing that the Rockefeller Foundation saw as problematic with liberation theology. In fact, they loved it. Coleman says that expect in the next coming decades massive amounts of terror, global terror. So here we are in 1992. He wrote this a year before the World Trade Center attack that was fostered by a false flag event with Ahmad Salam, who recorded being entrapped into that event. That was, I think, supposed to be what 9/11 would end up being. So in 1992, he was warning about 1993 and 2001, and that we would see an outbreak of the global war on terror, which was intended intentionally to push the narrative of Islam versus the Christian West, which, of course, the Christian West here really bared no resemblance to the medieval Christianity of Orthodox Christianity and the Roman Catholic world, going to war against Muslim countries or Muslim leaders or Saladin to retake Jerusalem. But it was all recast as a kind of clash of civilizations narrative on purpose, which the reason for these clashes and from this mindset, and we saw this when we looked at Jacques Attali's book a few months ago on the Fourth Hour, his book about the New World Order. He's he's the Kissinger of France. He actually says that the clashing together of all these things, whether it's capitalism versus communism or Islam versus Christianity, from the global elite perspective, they see no problem in this because this produces the necessary synthesis. They actually believe that this is necessary. You have to cause these things to smash together, and then you sort of prepare for and steer the synthesis that you wanted to begin with. And so the smashing together of East and West by design, the importation of Islam into the West by design, and getting Muslims and Christians to battle each other. And by the way, I'm not pro-Islam at all. I'm very anti-Islam, but I also recognize the higher level structure and status of the elites who intentionally bring these things into conflict. And that's done by entities like the IMF, the World Bank, the Royal Society, that's who does this. And they do it by design, and they do it on purpose to control and engineer and steer the synthesis as a result. For example, the worldwide terror apparatus that was set up right around this time that would become, the global war on terror, Al-Qaeda and so forth, ISIS, all these things, that was modeled on the structures of Gladio. All the terror cell networks that happened through Gladio literally just transferred into the same people training the Mujahideen to become Al-Qaeda and to become the so-called terror networks throughout the world. So the CIA later on Mossad as well, were involved in helping to train a lot of these groups, CIA especially in Gladio, to be the so-called terror armies that would go around under the banner of, I mean, I'm not saying under the banner falsely, they really are Muslims. They really do have a lot of these Salafi beliefs and so forth. So that's by design, and the ultimate goal, he says, is to establish this synthesis where, because of terror and because of the threat that terror poses, you would have this total tracking and tracing and control as a result. And certainly that's what 9/11 produced. And I don't think we're done with terror. We just saw, terror supposedly in Germany recently. So that's not going away. It's still a very powerful tool. And again, it goes back to Gladio, and especially the recent Germany events, very much like a Gladio type of event where it demonizes the right. In the case of Gladio, it demonized the left, but the same tactic can be used. Lastly, he says to take control of education in America with intent of completely destroying it and turning it into a socialist enterprise. So that's his Committee of 300 book. And he also has a great book called A One World Order Under a Socialist Dictatorship. And I recommend those if you haven't read them. They're good reads, as well as his Tavistock book. And you can get my books over at jasonanalysis.com if you're interested in my breakdowns of all this stuff through movies and symbolism. You can get Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2 signed copies in the shop at jasonanalysis.com.